Projet Je la lis, Gertrude Stein, numéro 20. Aujourd'hui, on est le 1er juin. Et je rappelle que j'improvise un jour sur deux une vidéo à partir de textes ou de réflexions sur l'œuvre de Gertrude Stein. Aujourd'hui, comme nous commençons le mois de juin, je m'étais dit que je chercherais des occurrences du mot June, du nom du mois juin, dans l'œuvre de Gertrude Stein, du moins dans les textes disponibles en ligne numérisés. Et il n'y en a pas beaucoup, je ne reviens pas dessus, j'en ai déjà parlé. Dans Geography and Plays, il y a 2 occurrences du mot June, mais ce n'est pas réellement ça qui m'intéresse. Je suis allé sur la page du projet Gutenberg australien pour y récupérer le texte et y consulter le texte de The Making of Americans. The Making of Americans, texte très important, texte séminal, un des premiers grands textes de Gertrude Stein. J'ai déjà eu l'occasion d'en parler brièvement lors d'une vidéo que j'avais d'ailleurs enregistrée en voiture, en conduisant. The Making of Americans, eh bien il n'y a aucune, alors que le texte est très très long, il n'y a aucune occurrence du mois de juin, du mot désignant le mois de juin, June, avec un J majuscule, ça n'existe pas. En revanche, ce qui est assez intéressant, c'est que j'ai cherché quel mot finissant par une, rimant éventuellement avec June, serait présent dans The Making of Americans, et en fait, cela m'a permis de me rendre compte que l'expression adjectif plus nom Great Fortune, grande fortune, apparaissait pas moins de 35 fois telle quelle, précisément, dans The Making of Americans. Et je vais vous les lire. This he had done before he had thought to go to Gossels, where he was to make his great fortune. And so when they first came to Gossels, where he was to make for himself a great fortune, they could afford to live in as good a hotel as was then there existing. And now it had come to him to go west to Gossels, where he was to make a great fortune. David Hersland, who was always strong in his beginning, commenced then to find the way to his great fortune. The father spent his days with rich men, for he had his business with them, he was making his great fortune among them. But more and more his wife lived with the poorer people who were living right around them. More and more his wife in her daily living had all of her being in her relation to the servants, seamstresses, governesses with whom she was living, and she was always of them, and always was above them, and in the same way she was with them, the poor for her, queer people around them. Some, and David Hersland, who had come to Gossels to make his great fortune, was one of them. Some of such a kind of men have it in them to be as big as all the world in the beginning. They are strong in beginning, and beginning things is all of living in them. Then each beginning comes to be in them an impatient feeling. David Hersland, who had come to Gossels to make for himself a great fortune, was of one kind of them. Et on se rend compte, après cette lecture de la 7e des 35 phrases dans laquelle on trouve l'expression Great Fortune, qu'il s'agit pour l'instant systématiquement du même personnage du Making of Americans, David Hersland, et que c'est toujours le même motif récurrent du fait qu'il s'est rendu dans la ville de Gossels pour y faire fortune. Donc la récurrence de cette expression Great Fortune est intimement liée à ce personnage, et puis à un mythe, bien sûr, un des grands mythes de l'Amérique, qui est le self-made man, qui est évidemment le fait de faire fortune, de se faire à partir de rien. Je continue. There are many ways of beginning. There are some things in living that have in them always more of beginning than other things in living. Education is such a part of living, eating and doctoring and making a great fortune in a place where everybody is beginning in the living. Et on voit ici cette 8e occurrence vraiment particulière par rapport justement à ce motif. La 9e occurrence est encore David Hersland. For him there was in his living ways of eating, ways of doctoring, ways of educating his children, ways of making his great fortune here in Gossels, where he was to make his important beginning. Et le concept de great fortune lié au concept de commencement, en fait de commencer à faire fortune. As I was saying, the father of the 3 of them whose lives we are soon now to be watching, Mr. David Hersland, had come to Gossels to make for himself his great fortune. Phrase suivante, great fortune, encore. Then there was for him in his living then the making of his great fortune. As I was saying, the biggest time in his living was when he was in Gossels, near the end of that beginning, when he was making his great fortune, when his wife was still in him as a tender feeling, etc., etc. Là, il y en a une phrase très paratactique et assez longue d'ailleurs. Mr. David Hirshland, in his middle living, was in Gossels, making his great fortune. Later they would think, if it ever came that there was an ending in him in his success in making a great fortune, they would perhaps think then that they had always known this about him, but in his middle living they could not know it of him. No one could then know it about him, which way the beginning in him would work out through him. Ça c'est une phrase monstrueuse. Là il y a une phrase assez longue encore, et c'est toujours pareil. When Mr. Hirshland was strongest in beginning and making his great fortune. Donc ces idées du milieu de la vie, du début de la vie, du début de la fortune, du début du moment où il se décide à faire fortune, où il cherche à faire fortune. When Mr. Hirshland was strongest in beginning and making his great fortune. On a vraiment le fonctionnement d'un leitmotiv presque rhapsodique en fait. She was cut off from Bridgepoint living, from travelling, from Eastern living. She had this to herself in her feeling. Later she went to Bridgepoint and she was a princess to them. She was a rich woman. Mr. Hirshland had then just made his great fortune. Mr. Hirshland's living just then was the beginning of the middle living in his great fortune, the beginning of a struggling to resist, the beginning of an ending to his fortune. Celle-là, elle est vraiment pas mal. C'est la 19e occurrence. 20e, bon, c'est une variation. 21e, c'est sur le même paragraphe. 22e. Ah, ça c'est pas mal. That was her living then, until he was dead, and she went back to the 10-acre place, where then her father and mother were living, and her mother was weakening then, and a little while later then she died there, and Martha finished her living staying with her father, who had then lost his great fortune. Première occurrence de la perte, le fait que une fortune ça n'est pas fait pour être fait, une fortune c'est fait pour être perdu. Later, in the ending of his middle living, he was beginning to lose his great fortune. Voilà une phrase très complexe aussi par rapport à ces concepts de fin et de début. Je vais essayer de la traduire. Later, plus tard, in the ending of his middle living, vers les derniers jours du milieu de sa vie, he was beginning, il commençait to lose his great fortune, à perdre sa grande fortune. Later in his middle living, he was beginning to lose his great fortune. Quasi répétition identique de cette précédente occurrence. He was beginning then to lose his great fortune. À nouveau variation. Martha Redfern then lived at home all the time. Her father was losing his great fortune. In the ending of his middle living, he was beginning to lose his great fortune. Là, je crois qu'on a la répétition vraiment à l'identique de la 24e occurrence dans la 28e. At the ending of his middle living, he was beginning, not succeeding in living, he was beginning losing his great fortune, avec une construction très curieuse du verbe begin. 29e occurrence, plus que 5. At the ending of his middle living, he was beginning, not succeeding in living, he was beginning losing his great fortune. Là, c'est à la fin d'un paragraphe, la répétition à l'identique de la phrase qui terminait le paragraphe précédent et que j'ai déjà lu. He was then beginning definitely not succeeding in living. He was beginning then really losing his great fortune. At the ending of his middle living, he was beginning not succeeding in living. He was beginning losing his great fortune. Ah, là on a une phrase beaucoup plus longue dans laquelle une répétition de ce losing his great fortune est reprise. L'avant-dernière également est insérée dans une phrase très très longue commence par It did help Martha some then, it did help her a little to be able to go to college, as she was wanting to do then, but they were not very interesting ever to each other, Martha and Alfred Hirshland. Ça continue, et on fait la dernière occurrence, et celle-là c'est encore dans une phrase très longue, vers le milieu de The Making of Americans. Je lis. He went on studying then. He came then to know more and more men, and more women, and 3 years later, and then already perhaps his father was beginning the losing his great fortune, and his mother was beginning completely weakening, and Martha was beginning to have a trouble seriously in living, and David his brother was coming to Bridgepoint too, to do more studying. These things in the living in Gossels were not then really important in Alfred Hirshland when he was coming then to know Julia Denning. Gossels living was inside him. then pretty completely not anymore in him. His son, living, was not then anymore in him. He always had his own being in him. He had now pretty completely his own living in him. In a way, now a little he was not quite doing in his living what everyone near him was doing. He was not doing then in his living whatever he was doing with them. Et j'en suis arrivé au bout en ayant un peu triché, en n'ayant pas absolument lu tout, mais en ayant quand même parcouru ces 35 occurrences de His Great Fortune ou The Great Fortune dans The Making of Americans. On continue après-demain.